Welcome to Just a Cup on Believe. I am Bryan Fetzer, and we're going to have a massive conversation talking about mindfulness, mental health, peak performance. It can kind of go on and on. On today's conversation, I have Dr. Adam Shunk, who is duly certified neuropsychologist, sports psychologist, and was a pretty incredible athlete in his own right back in the day, just a few years ago. So, Adam, I'm excited to have you on and excited to talk about everything. There's so many topics that are so relevant today in basically the mental space. So, I'm fired up.
It is. Yeah, it is an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you and reconnect, Coach Fetzer. You still had a huge impact, on not only my career as a track and field athlete, but my wife, was one of your athletes. So your name comes up time to time on a regular basis in our house.
There's make sure you don't put any swear words around it when you're a kid. No, I think you've got such a unique perspective. I think we're specifically dealing with the sports side of things because you were an elite athlete. I mean, you were U.S. national team, national champ, NCAA champ. I mean, you competed in the highest level in track and field, and then now you're getting to kind of share with professional athletes. I mean, you work with WNBA and NBA players and other professional organizations. How do you think that benefits you, or how does that help you out, kind of having those conversations with a fellow professional athlete per se?
Yeah. What's interesting is I reflected on that not too long ago. And it's, when I first started as sports psychology, I relied so much on my experience as an athlete, but over the course of, working with athletes at so many different levels, in so many different sports, the NBA culture is completely different, than another pro team culture. So I feel like it's one of those things where, like, the more you know, the less you know. Like, over time, I think that sense of like what I did as an athlete, how track, the mental side of that has kind of been replaced with this respect that, every sport is so unique, every athlete is so unique, and just really trying to step into their world, and understand what it's like for them. And if there are some tidbits, that I can use from my own experience or past clients, obviously, that makes the job so much easier.
That does make sense now that you mention it, because I mean, when you first start coaching, you rely on yourself as an athlete. That's what comes. You coach how you were coached, and then as you develop as a coach, you kind of pivot away from that into what you know and how you do things. I guess I never would have thought about it that way, but it's so true, so true. So when you're talking about some different topics that come to mind when I think of psychology. One is mindfulness. And that's a buzzword now that people say all the time. When I say mindfulness, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I completely agree that the more we've learned about it, it's almost taken a mainstream approach. And now there's so many different people that have kind of redefined it and, have different ways of building those skills. For me, I think how I conceptualize it is it's all about just, developing a relationship with your thoughts. I don't think there's ever a time in my career that a coach or somebody sat me down and just, think about how your mind works. When you're competing, how do you talk to yourself? Are you using positive self-talk? Is it kind of a negative undertone? Are you focused on the things you have control over? Do you, get distracted? At what level do you need to think? One thing we know is, like, when an athlete's in the zone, how they describe those rare breakthrough moments. It's almost like they're not even thinking. It's just this connection between the mind and body and absolute trust. So, when I think about like mindfulness, what that is just, kind of respecting that, that part of who we are and starting to study it. I don't think as an athlete you can wait until the middle of a competition and be like, okay, I'm going to work on how to focus, how to, what's the right self-talk to, commit to. It's almost like you need to put the work in, behind the scenes, learn how your mind works, kind of come up with a template, learn how to use breathing and other skills. So collectively you can, build this skill set that when you need it in sports, it's a valuable tool.
Why did you go into psychology? Like, I mean, what, I mean, as you're describing those things, what made you want to study and learn and become what you are?
Yeah. Well, you remember me as an undergrad where I was not the most serious student. I think I had 6 different majors. It was just bouncing around, trying everything out. But I graduated from North Carolina. So it was with the last 3 semesters left, I had to take some psychology courses and was like, I love this. Absolutely. Just as an undergrad, it was like, I want to, quickly get a major, in 3 semesters and maybe pursue this. And then when I went to grad school, I studied a lot of medicine and biology too. So I really wanted to get into the field of neuropsychology. And that's exactly what I did for my master's and doctorate, to where I wanted to just understand like how the brain, controls our bodies and all the complexities there.
Right. Wow. That's pretty deep. What, so, okay. So you go into the neuropsychology path and start studying that. What is something that you learned in that kind of blew your mind? No, no pun intended on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is just how integrated our brains are. It's not like one part of your brain does one thing and another part. It's the intersection between all these parts.
Right.
And something as complicated as emotional regulation, which all athletes, it's like I need to get myself fired up, but I don't want to get so fired up I'm nervous, and just how, like those connections within the brain all come together and how difficult that is, but also the power in learning. I think every coach, teaches breathing techniques, mindfulness, and
right.
The reality is you really understand that on a deep level. It's like that stuff's evidence-based. It works.
What's an example that if you're with an athlete and say, hey, you need to calm down, or they need to be calmer, I should say. What's a technique, or what's something that you might say to them to kind of get them to relax?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that comes down to, have I worked with this athlete in the past and I kind of know what's going on, how much mental training skills they have. So it differs for everybody. But, I think in general, it's just the idea of taking a moment, calming yourself down, usually through breath work, and just being present, kind of letting go all the distractions, past performances, future, expectations, and just really getting them to, be in the here and now. It's kind of a cliche psychology term of,
right,
what we're targeting.
Well, we were talking before we started the show just a little bit about why sports psychology and why psychology has kind of come in the forefront of sports just in recent years. I mean, I think 10 years ago, it wasn't very prevalent. Now it seems like every pro team, every college team, you hear more about it. There's Instagram posts and all kind of social media things. Why do you think it just all of a sudden kind of hit the light switch?
I mean, I do think social media has had a lot to do with that. Like, information is just so accessible. These little, TikTok videos, you can get a 30-second, hit on so many different things.
Right.
I think that, and then mostly, like, I mean, there's a lot of generational changes.
Hmm.
Mental health for years and years was so stigmatized. It was almost viewed as a weakness. And now we have all these athletes that, are coming out and talking about it. I
Right.
mean, I quote this all the time to athletes, but, if being an elite athlete was easy, everybody would do it. I mean, when you're great at something and
Hmm.
you're performing at a high level, there's so much pressure, expectation, kind of difficult dynamics, managing your family, work-life balance, upcoming contracts. Like there's just so much on an athlete's plate nowadays that all of them are stressed, you know?
Is is there any like specific factor that you've seen that kind of differentiates the good from the great, or
Yeah.
the great from the goats?
Yeah. Well, I will say one of my favorite experiences I've had in my career is like doing NBA draft interviews,
Hmm.
where basically you just sit back and, listen to athletes kind of tell their story. You get asked some questions and figure out kind of, what their why is, and I think one thing that kind of surprised me is when somebody has that special it almost always comes from a place of adversity.
Hmm.
There's a lot of backstories where athletes that, have gone on to accomplish great things, it's because they've overcome some great things. Things like grit, mental toughness. I mean, that stuff's forged through,
Huh.
adversity a lot of times. So
Right.
I think, anytime I'm like looking at an athlete, that's something I want to know is like, what have you been through? Because that experience is often the best teacher and a lot of good insight for, us finding our why and, developing strength.
Man, when you say finding your why, that is probably, I think, it's one of the most profound, but yet easiest things that somebody could kind of start thinking about. Like,
Yeah.
why do you do what you do? And I don't think enough people, successful people, do. I think, but there's a lot of individuals, especially younger individuals. They have no clue.
Yeah.
They don't even try. Um, why do you think older generations kind of got that a little bit more than maybe kids today? Like finding your why. Like,
I mean, my mind goes to the whole idea of like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation.
okay,
When you're a kid, like, your why. Playing sports is fun.
right,
There's no real pressure, expectations. You get together with your buddies, and we love it. And honestly, most of the time, people perform better, when they are younger. And then
true.
as people mature, as we advance throughout the ranks in sports, there is just so much pressure and expectations placed on athletes.
True story.
So it's almost like what we have to do is develop this dialogue to shift our attention away from the external pressures and contracts and performance results to, why am I really doing this? I love to compete.
Mm.
I love to be on a team. I want to challenge myself and put myself in difficult dynamics.
Is there something that a professional athlete struggles with more than a college athlete? Or because I know you've worked with both. Is there anything that differentiates them, what they struggle with?
I think, I hate to quote a rapper, but, Biggie saying, more money, more problems, it really is like,
Interesting.
and it's interesting because now that college is getting so professionalized, the NIL deals are, really peaking up. It's almost like it's, I see much more similarities in the
Hmm.
issues that college kids are having to face and pros than I did, let's say 5-10 years ago.
Interesting. Well, I mean, and you don't just work with athletes. I mean, you work with a wide spectrum of individuals. Is there something that's different between the athletes and non-athletes struggles?
Um,
Similar.
it's, I mean, I think the big thing is just when you're an athlete, you have accountability. If you go to, your job, nobody's really posting results, following up. You have a bad day at work, nobody gives you, hell on your news feed. Um, so yeah, I think just managing all that stuff.
We're going to come back to that because I think that is an interesting topic. You are listening to Just a Cup on Believe. Hey, please like, subscribe, share. You can get us on Apple, Spotify, really anywhere you get podcasts. You can also get us on YouTube. So make sure you share this episode as we dive in more with Dr. Adam Shunk, talking about everything mental. I mean, it's hard to classify something as mental health or mental anything just because there's so many buzzwords nowadays. But you just touched on accountability, and you mentioned social media in a way. How much do you think the development or the blowing up of social media has affected just general people's psychological health and well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I'm by no means an expert in that area, but I know a little bit about the research, and it's obviously we're seeing profound effects, on mental health because of social media. And yes, it is, whether you're an athlete or any person, it's changing how we look at life, I feel like.
So I've heard this. Okay, this kind of gets on that a little bit, but I've heard, like the brain develops at 25. I've heard different things like that. How close or how off is that?
Yeah, I mean, most brain development happens earlier in life, but the executive functions, the frontal cortex, it continues to get myelinated. And the idea of like neuroplasticity, all that stuff is, going on up 25, 28. And then even after the brain is fully developed, one thing we know is it continues to be changeable, So yeah, I think you're spot on that 25 is when we know from just a, normal development standpoint where most of those core processes kind of, are set in place.
And now we're getting kids at 15, 16, 17, getting on social media, and there's bullying, there's, shaming, there's all kind of. I am so thankful that social media wasn't around when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I probably would never get a job because I would have been stupid for various reasons. But when you start thinking about just how much earlier that pressure gets put on kids.
Yeah.
And as we all know, people aren't putting the bad times on social media. It's all good times.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite referrals to work with is maybe like a sophomore, junior in high school that is starting to get recruited.
Okay.
Back in the day, I feel like, it was a manageable process. But now it's all about just announcements. Like if you're following a school, you see if they sign somebody in your position,
Right.
what their needs are. And it creates this incredible, difficult dynamic, for an athlete to, what's right for me? What am I looking for from college? And not to get caught up with, these sensationalized moments of, I've had athletes tell me the only thing that really matters is when they post that, that adrenaline hit they get of, I'm going to this school, even though they may feel like that's not the best fit for me, like that social comparison cue is.
Do you think that's why so many kids are transferring now? Because they're making rash, emotional led decisions and not necessarily the best decisions for themselves.
I mean, that's probably a part of it. I wouldn't say that's the main thing causing it, but
Right.
yeah, I mean, the idea of, really deciding where you want to go and understanding your plan and process. Because, I mean, from being in college athletics, when you get there, everything's different. You almost have to fail in order to figure it out. And
True.
most coaches will describe that. It's like, we want to, recruit an athlete, watch them on a day they fail, because my job is I'm going to bring you into an environment that you're going to fail, and you have to be able to figure it out.
Well, it's interesting you say fail, because the event that you did college and professionally was the high jump, which you end on a failure, which is I don't think a lot of people understand that two events in track and field are 100% based on the end of failure. Like pole vault, high jump, the winner is the one that fails last, which it is kind of crazy to say that, but
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that shaped you at all with different, just looking at life a little differently? Because
That is,
even when you won a national championship, you still failed,
yeah, still raise the bar and try to go higher. And, inevitably it's
which is crazy. But
yeah, I mean, as a sports psychologist, that is a theme that I work with athletes on all the time, is just growth mindset. I
hmm,
mean, one thing we know about great athletes is they embrace failure. I think Kobe was, notorious for that he used to get more excited to have bad games than good games. And the reason being, when you fail, it's like there's room for growth, Okay, if you play a great game, it's like, all right, what I did worked, go do it again. But when you fail, there's always like something that can feed your goal setting process, something you can go work on.
hmm.
So now that you say that, I'd never really reflected on that, but that may be a big part of why I'm so big on just, talking to, my clients about embracing failure, working through it. And, just that's a part of sports.
Okay, I'm gonna let you be my psychologist for a second. And
Uh-oh.
I say that in is I remember, and I've heard, I say this because I've heard a lot of other coaches. I heard Nick Saban recently. I heard this. I heard Tom Brady say it. I remember the negative, the failures, the championships we didn't won, didn't win, the where we didn't kind of reach those expectations. I remember them so much more than the wins. I barely remember the wins. I barely remember the successes. But you can say, hey, what are some years that you had horrible years as a coach? Man, I could rattle them off. Why in the world is that?
Yeah. Well, now as a neuropsychologist, I get to talk for a minute that,
Okay.
so much of memory and how it's consolidated in the brain is through emotional attachment.
Hmm.
And that's why things like post-traumatic, disorder, stress disorder, and things have such a profound effect on people. Is when you have a negative emotion, it's almost like hardwired deeper in your brain.
Hmm.
And there's, these moments that they always just come back to. So
Yeah, I mean, because I remember it, speaking specifically at Virginia, 2017, third in the country, lots of national champions, phenomenal year. I don't remember that as much as 2018 when we didn't live up to expectations.
yeah,
Like I remember that. I can think of all different times during the year that I
yeah,
was like, man, if we'd have done this, if I'd have made a better decision, if I'd have thought, and then I mean maybe that's just, but I do know coaches that don't think that way.
yeah,
They think all about the great things that they did, and
yeah. Well, I think, I know you well enough too to be confident saying that, you're a person that adheres to growth mindset.
mm,
You always want to get better.
right,
And that's, I think, exactly what we're talking about, is when somebody is always on that path of, no matter how good I do, I want to get better. Okay, once I accomplish something, what's next?
right,
Which we know is a key attribute for elite athletes.
yes,
It makes
very
sense
much so.
why, just behaviorally and cognitively, like why, you may hang on to these negative moments more. a lot of your motivation may be kind of wrapped up in, just the comeback. After failure, I take pride in, working through it, finding my next step and all that.
That's it's pretty interesting. It's always interesting to get the opinion of how. I mean, I'm fascinated by how the mind works, and just how and why certain people perform better than others when they're of similar abilities, and you see that all the time in sports. That why one person that was uber talented couldn't get it done, and somebody that was not quite as talented became a superstar. I mean, those kind of things are fascinating, and I'm sure you get to see that a lot.
Yeah, and I think the higher level you get in sport, I love this when I go do presentations. I'll ask high schoolers, what percent of your sport is mental, and a lot of times they're 50, 60, 70%. You go to college, they're usually 80% or more. You ask pros and they're like 95. I've done that hundreds of times, but doing it consistently under pressure, having the focus to do it in that moment, a lot of sports at a high level comes down to just the mental application of your skills.
All right, I'm gonna shift it a little bit here because I think
we're getting deep in with this.
We could get real deep in it, but I was gonna ask this because I think it's unique in the sense that so much in sport is being the poster child. So much of sport is being, the figure out in front, and psychology is so much behind the scenes that it's almost a thankless job in a way because it's not what people perceive. You see strength coaches, they're always leading the team out. They're doing that kind of part. The mindset per se of a psychologist has got to be a little more unique compared to others because you're not at the forefront. If you're at the forefront, then there's probably something wrong, I guess. Am I tracking with that pretty correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And my mentor, one of the first things he taught me, his famous sports psychologist, actually works for the Green Bay Packers now, is if you're ever going to take take credit for somebody's successes, you better accept their failures too. And so much of our job is, we can't do it for people. We are not the ones that are changing their thoughts, changing their emotions, building their motivation. We're just the ones that try to help them understand what they're capable of, identifying kind of barriers getting in their way, and helping them, do it on their own. I don't think there's any athlete I could ever say that their success was attributed to what I did with them.
Interesting. And that's very much so, contrary to how most people that work with others make themselves perceived. I mean, everybody's, well, you see what I did with this athlete. I mean, and I say strength coaches, and I shouldn't bash strength coaches, but that's the perception a lot. You have this laundry list of athletes that they worked with, and with a psychologist, you're keeping it kind of in the background. And
it's probably no different than being a coach. It's like some of the athletes that you've done, man, I give myself an A+ in coaching them. I taught them everything. They may not get the result, right?
Oh,
and then other times it's like, here's this just physical freak that just lucked into it, and it's like, their mental approach really wasn't, I didn't really help much with that. So
that is very true, because I think it's a slippery slope trying to take credit for what God gave somebody. I mean, somebody just got blessed with a freakish talent, to say that you did it. You might have helped steer them along for a little while, but you didn't really do a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I love about my job too. Like I really feel like I learn as much from my athletes,
Hmm.
and I gain from kind of the stuff we work on as they do from me, and it's really cool to have gotten to work with some of the best athletes, at the highest levels to
Right.
just understand, like, what does that look like? How are they so special? That mindset. I mean, you read about it in a book, but it's different to hear, somebody that has just performed at the highest level, just kind of, talk through how they approach their craft.
All right. This might be putting you on a spot, but since I know your wife, I'm gonna say this. Um, how has your occupation shaped you as a husband and father?
Oh, that's a good question. It's funny because I have two teenage boys now. Well, 12 and 14, and then my little daughter's 10.
Which makes me feel old.
And it's it's funny because trying to talk to them, trying to get them to think, even though I may, I have pro athletes trusting me, listening, seeking guidance, it doesn't exactly carry over at home.
Right.
Maybe an expert here, but doesn't always work. But no, I think things like, just building a good relationship, communication, trying to just be empathetic. We have a family of 5. Wife works, it's busy, kids are in all kinds of sports. Like, our lives are crazy. So
Right.
I think it helps me more in that area of just being able to be present, coping with the challenges, modern families face, and all that. So
All right. I'm gonna get you out of here on this one. And it's a question I try to ask every single person we have on. What advice would you give to the younger Adam Shunk when you were coming up? If you could go back and say, hey,
take more risks and put yourself out there.
hmm,
I think a lot, and when you talk to people on their deathbeds, there's all this research looking at that. That's usually the number one thing that comes up is, I just held back. I didn't do something I felt I should have. So I think just taking more chances. And, the older I get, being in my late 40s now, like I'm looking back and just, it's like life's a book, and there's all these different chapters. And just the idea of when you're doing something, just be present, enjoy it. My career in college, like I wish I could go back and just, hey, don't stress about it. This is probably the funnest phase of your life. Enjoy it. When I first got a job, working with a professional team, it's like you're so nervous, you don't want to mess up, but just enjoy it. Be you, take some risks, and that's how you learn and figure it out.
that's some good advice. It's very practical, good advice. I love it. Now they get me thinking about risks and so forth. Thanks so much for jumping on and talking, sharing some wisdom. Uh, more and more people need to know and hear what you're saying.
I appreciate it, man. It has been a complete honor to just, reconnect and
Oh,
get to spend some time with you. So thank
I
you for the opportunity.
I no, I appreciate it. Hey, this was Dr. Adam Shunk, and he's a sports psychologist, a neuropsychologist, and we had him on Just a Cup. Super excited. Make sure you subscribe, like, and tune in. We release these every single week. It's on Believe. And have a great one, and we'll see you next time. God bless.